Kwame lived a simple life in the small, close-knit village of Amengwi. He was a man of routine, someone who could always be counted on. By day, he worked in the fields, cultivating crops that fed his neighbors and kept his family well. By evening, he'd return home to his wife, Amina, and their young son, Kofi. They lived in a modest, but cozy house at the edge of the village, surrounded by trees that whispered in the wind. In their home, love was never spoken aloud, but it was always felt, like an unspoken promise between them. Kwame never doubted their bond. Amina was his heart, and their life together was one of simplicity and mutual respect. One evening, as Kwame arrived home after a long day's work, he noticed something was off. Amina wasn't waiting by the door as she usually did. The house was quiet, too quiet. He called out for her, but there was no answer. As he walked through the house, he found her sitting in the living room, her eyes distant and filled with a sadness that he had never seen before. Amina wasn't the type to wear her emotions openly, and this sudden shift caught him off guard. She looked up at him with a somber gaze and sighed deeply. "Kwame, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice trembling with an unfamiliar vulnerability. The calmness of her tone was at odds with the storm brewing in her eyes. Kwame, who was always so sure of his place in the world, suddenly felt a chill run down his spine. His chest tightened as he sat down beside her, unsure of what to expect. Amina took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to say what was weighing on her heart. "I've been seeing someone else. I know this will hurt you, but I can't keep hiding it any longer." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating the room. Kwame felt his world tilt on its axis. The woman he loved, the woman he had trusted with everything, had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. His mind raced, unable to process what Amina had just said. How could this be happening? They had built their life together, they had shared so many dreams. He had never once questioned her loyalty. Amina continued, her voice breaking as she spoke. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Kwame. I love you, but I felt so alone. You've been distant, lost in your work, and I needed something more." Her confession hung between them like a gaping wound, and for the first time in their relationship, Kwame realized how much he had taken her presence for granted. He had been so focused on providing for his family, so consumed by the weight of his responsibilities, that he had neglected the one person who mattered most. Kwame sat there in stunned silence, the shock reverberating through his body. How had he missed the signs? The late nights when Amina would be quiet and withdrawn, the little gestures that now seemed so obvious, the distance that had slowly crept between them over the past few months. He had been blind, too caught up in his own world to notice the unraveling of the love he thought was unbreakable. "Who is he?" Kwame finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question felt like a punch to the gut. He didn't want to know, but he needed to. He needed to understand how this had happened. Amina hesitated for a moment, her eyes filled with shame. "His name is Kofi," she said, and the name felt like an arrow piercing Kwame's chest. Not only had his wife betrayed him, but she had also turned to another man from their own village, someone Kwame knew, someone he had trusted. The sense of betrayal cut deeper than anything Kwame had ever felt before. Kwame stood up, his body trembling with a mixture of rage, heartbreak, and disbelief. He had always prided himself on being a good husband, on being a man of honor. How could she do this to him? How could she destroy everything they had built together? "I don't know who you are anymore," he muttered, the words slipping from his lips like poison. He didn't recognize the woman in front of him, the woman who had once been his everything. The love they had shared felt like a distant memory now, something that had slipped away with every lie, every moment of silence that had passed between them. Amina reached out to him, her eyes filled with tears. "Kwame, please, I never wanted to hurt you. I know I made a mistake, but please understand, I was lonely. I needed to feel seen, to feel loved." Kwame turned away from her, unable to look her in the eyes. The woman who had once been his greatest source of joy had become a stranger to him in the span of a few words. His heart ached, but there was something else simmering beneath the pain, a growing anger, a fire that refused to be extinguished. He had been betrayed, but he was also furious with himself for not seeing the cracks in their relationship sooner. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Amina," he said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." The weight of those words hung in the air, and for a moment, the room was filled with nothing but silence. Kwame's mind was a whirlwind of confusion and hurt. His love for Amina had been his anchor, his foundation, but now it felt like it had been shattered, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty. How could he go on living with this betrayal, knowing that the woman he had once loved had been with another man? As the hours passed, Kwame's heart grew heavy with a sense of loss. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now seemed like a prison, the walls closing in around him. He couldn't stay here. Not with the weight of Amina's betrayal hanging over him, not with the knowledge that everything he had believed in was a lie. "I need to leave," Kwame said, his voice low and resolute. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do, but he knew he couldn't stay. The pain was too much to bear. Amina's cries echoed in the background, but Kwame didn't hear them. He was already walking away from the life he had known, from the woman he had loved. That night, as Kwame walked through the darkened streets of Amangwi, his mind was consumed by a single thought: his life had been changed forever. The woman he had trusted above all else had shattered his world. He was lost, and he didn't know how to find his way back. Kwame spent the next few days wandering aimlessly through the village, unsure of where to go or what to do. The once familiar streets now seemed foreign, and the people who had once greeted him with warmth now eyed him with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Word of his wife's betrayal had spread quickly through the village, and every corner he turned, he could feel the weight of their gazes upon him. There was no escaping it, no hiding from the shame. The man who had always been a pillar of strength and honor now found himself broken and vulnerable. He tried to find solace in the quiet places that had always offered him peace, his favorite spot by the river, the small grove of trees where he'd once gone to pray for guidance, but nothing seemed to bring him the relief he so desperately sought. The hurt ran too deep, and the anger bubbled just beneath the surface, ready to spill over at any moment. The woman he had loved, the woman he had shared his life with, had destroyed everything with a single act of betrayal. Kwame found himself at a crossroads. He didn't know what he wanted or needed anymore, but he knew he couldn't stay in the village, surrounded by the whispers and the pity. He couldn't stay and face the looks of disappointment from his family, the elders, or his neighbors. His pride, though wounded, refused to allow him to be a subject of gossip. So, he decided to leave. He needed space to think, to clear his mind, to figure out who he was in this new, broken world. The decision was difficult. His family would be worried, but his mind was made up. He packed a small bag with essentials, left a note for his parents, and walked away from the life he had known. He left his home and his village behind, heading for the dense forests that bordered the area, hoping to find some sense of peace in the isolation. For several days, Kwame journeyed through the wilderness, allowing the solitude to consume him. The silence of the forest was both a comfort and a curse. On one hand, it gave him the space he needed to think, but on the other, it forced him to confront the deep loneliness that had taken root in his soul. His mind would often drift back to Amina, to the moments they had shared, to the love they had once held for each other. But now, those memories felt like ghosts, haunting him with what had been lost. "I need to leave," Kwame said, his voice low and resolute. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do, but he knew he couldn't stay. The pain was too much to bear. Amina's cries echoed in the background, but Kwame didn't hear them. He was already walking away from the life he had known, from the woman he had loved. That night, as Kwame walked through the darkened streets of Amangwi, his mind was consumed by a single thought: his life had been changed forever. The woman he had trusted above all else had shattered his world. He was lost, and he didn't know how to find his way back. Kwame spent the next few days wandering aimlessly through the village, unsure of where to go or what to do. The once familiar streets now seemed foreign, and the people who had once greeted him with warmth now eyed him with a mixture of sympathy and curiosity. Word of his wife's betrayal had spread quickly through the village, and every corner he turned, he could feel the weight of their gazes upon him. There was no escaping it, no hiding from the shame. The man who had always been a pillar of strength and honor now found himself broken and vulnerable. He tried to find solace in the quiet places that had always offered him peace, his favorite spot by the river, the small grove of trees where he'd once gone to pray for guidance, but nothing seemed to bring him the relief he so desperately sought. The hurt ran too deep, and the anger bubbled just beneath the surface, ready to spill over at any moment. The woman he had loved, the woman he had shared his life with, had destroyed everything with a single act of betrayal. Kwame found himself at a crossroads. He didn't know what he wanted or needed anymore, but he knew he couldn't stay in the village, surrounded by the whispers and the pity. He couldn't stay and face the looks of disappointment from his family, the elders, or his neighbors. His pride, though wounded, refused to allow him to be a subject of gossip. So, he decided to leave. He needed space to think, to clear his mind, to figure out who he was in this new, broken world. The decision was difficult. His family would be worried, but his mind was made up. He packed a small bag with essentials, left a note for his parents, and walked away from the life he had known. He left his home and his village behind, heading for the dense forests that bordered the area, hoping to find some sense of peace in the isolation. For several days, Kwame journeyed through the wilderness, allowing the solitude to consume him. The silence of the forest was both a comfort and a curse. On one hand, it gave him the space he needed to think, but on the other, it forced him to confront the deep loneliness that had taken root in his soul. His mind would often drift back to Amina, to the moments they had shared, to the love they had once held for each other. But now, those memories felt like ghosts, haunting him with what had been lost. One evening, as Kwame sat by a campfire, staring into the flames, he was visited by an old man. The man appeared from the shadows of the trees, his presence as sudden as it was unsettling. Kwame didn't notice him at first, so deep was his contemplation. It wasn't until the old man spoke that he looked up. "You look troubled, my son," the old man said, his voice gentle but firm, as if he had seen many men in Kwame's state before. "What weighs on your heart?" Kwame was taken aback. He wasn't used to strangers approaching him in the wilderness. He had been alone for so long, the sight of another person was a surprise. "I don't know you," Kwame replied, his voice hoarse from days of silence. "Why are you here?" The old man smiled, his face lined with age but his eyes bright and knowing. "I have lived a long time, young man, and I have learned that there is no place in the world where you are truly alone. Even in the most remote places, people find one another when they need it most." Kwame stared at the old man, unsure of what to make of him. But there was something in the man's presence, something familiar yet strange, that made him feel as though he was meant to meet him. "Who are you?" Kwame asked, his curiosity piqued despite himself. The old man sat down across from him, unfazed by the question. "I am someone who has seen the pain of the world and understands it. I've known loss, betrayal, and heartache. But I've also known healing, growth, and peace. I am a traveler, like you, but I travel through life, not just the land." Kwame, though wary, felt drawn to the old man's words. There was something wise in his voice, something that suggested he had walked the same path of suffering. Perhaps this stranger had the answers that Kwame so desperately sought. "I've lost everything," Kwame confessed, his voice breaking as the weight of his pain hit him all over again. "The woman I loved betrayed me, and I don't know how to go on. I don't know who I am anymore." The old man nodded slowly, as though he had been waiting for Kwame to say those words. Betrayal is a terrible thing, yes. It breaks the soul, shatters trust, and leaves you feeling lost. But it is not the end of your story. It is a turning point, a moment when you must decide who you will become in the face of that pain. Kwame looked at the old man, his brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? How can I move forward? How can I ever forgive her for what she did? The old man leaned forward, his eyes locking with Kwame's. Forgiveness is not for the one who wronged you, my son. It is for you. It is a way of freeing yourself from the chains of anger and pain that bind you. If you hold on to this betrayal, you allow it to control your life. But if you let it go, if you forgive, you free yourself to heal and grow. Kwame recoiled at the thought. Forgive her? After what she did to me? How can I possibly do that? The old man's expression softened, his eyes filled with compassion. Forgiving someone does not mean forgetting what they did. It means choosing to move forward without carrying the weight of their actions. It means allowing yourself the space to heal. If you continue to let her betrayal define you, you will never be free. Kwame sat in silence, the old man's words sinking deep into his heart. Could he really forgive Amina? Could he let go of the anger and betrayal that had consumed him for so long? The idea seemed impossible, but as he sat there, staring into the fire, something inside him shifted. Perhaps the old man was right. Perhaps forgiveness wasn't about excusing her actions, but about freeing himself from the hold they had on his soul. The next few days passed in a blur as Kwame reflected on the old man's words. He continued his journey through the forest, but now, instead of focusing on the pain, he began to look inward, searching for answers. He realized that his life had been defined by others' expectations, by his role as a provider, a husband, and a father. But now, in the solitude of the wilderness, he had to redefine himself. He had to discover who he was without Amina, without the village, without the life he had known. Slowly, a sense of clarity began to take root within him. He was no longer the man who had been betrayed. He was no longer defined by his pain. He was a man who had the power to choose his path, who could decide how he would respond to the hardships that life threw his way. It was time to go home, but Kwame knew that when he returned to the village, he would not be the same man who had walked away in anger. He would be stronger, wiser, and perhaps, in time, ready to forgive, not for Amina, but for himself. Kwame's journey back to Amangwi was long, the weight of his thoughts making the road seem endless. Every step he took felt like a step closer to reclaiming himself, but also closer to facing the wreckage of his former life. The man who had left the village in anger and heartbreak was returning as someone different, someone who had learned a hard truth. Healing and forgiveness weren't things that happened overnight, but they had to begin somewhere. As he walked through the forest, the rustling leaves whispered to him, as if they, too, understood the struggle he had gone through. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the path, but Kwame didn't mind. He was ready. He was returning to the place where his life had been torn apart, and though he feared what awaited him, he also felt an unspoken strength within him that he hadn't had before. When he finally entered the village, the familiar sight of his home and the people he once knew stirred a deep sense of nostalgia within him. But he was no longer the man who had left with broken pride and a heart full of anger. His steps were quieter now, more measured, as though he was carefully considering each move he made. The villagers, who had whispered behind his back since the betrayal had surfaced, looked at him with a mix of pity, curiosity, and awkwardness. They had expected him to be a shell of the man they once admired, to return defeated and angry. But Kwame was different now. He no longer felt the need to prove anything to them. His first stop was the house he had once shared with Amina. He stood outside for a long while, staring at the door, unsure of how to approach what lay within. The house was still the same, but everything felt changed. The memories of laughter, of love, of quiet evenings together, all of it seemed to belong to someone else now. Taking a deep breath, Kwame finally knocked on the door. Amina opened it slowly, her eyes widening when she saw him. She was thinner than he remembered, her face more tired, the sparkle in her eyes dimmed by the weight of the guilt that had settled in her heart. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The silence between them was thick, filled with years of unspoken pain and regret. Amina finally broke the silence. "Kwame," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect you to come back." Kwame looked at her, his heart a jumble of emotions. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to let her know how deeply she had hurt him. But as he stood there, looking at the woman who had once been the center of his world, something inside him had shifted. The anger that had consumed him for weeks was still there, but it was tempered now by something else, understanding. The old man's words echoed in his mind: forgiveness wasn't for Amina, it was for him. It was a way to free himself from the chains that bound him. "I've come to talk," Kwame said finally, his voice calm, though there was still a trace of the hurt he couldn't entirely shake. "I need to understand." Amina nodded and stepped aside, silently inviting him in. As he walked into the house, it felt both familiar and foreign. It was the same space where they had shared their life together, but now it felt like a ghost of what it had been. Amina led him to the small living room where they had spent countless nights talking, laughing, dreaming of the future. But now, all of those dreams felt shattered, like pieces of a puzzle that no longer fit. "I don't know what to say, Kwame," Amina said, sitting down across from him. Her voice cracked with emotion. "I've thought about this moment every day since you left. I know I can never undo what I did, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I could handle it, but I was wrong." Kwame took a deep breath, sitting down beside her. He could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of the mistake she had made. But he also saw the woman he had once loved, the woman who had stood by him through thick and thin. The hurt was still there, but there was something else now, a chance for healing, for moving forward, even if that meant accepting the reality of what had happened. "Amina, I don't know what to do with all of this," he said, his voice low and steady. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again, but I've learned that holding on to this anger is only hurting me. I have to find a way to move on, for my own peace." Amina nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or maybe ever. But I hope you can find peace, even if it means we don't have a future together." Kwame looked at her, his mind racing. He had spent so much time focusing on his own hurt, on his own sense of betrayal, that he hadn't truly considered the depth of her own suffering. The guilt, the regret, the isolation she had felt in the wake of her actions. He didn't excuse what she had done, but he realized that forgiveness wasn't just about absolving her of blame, it was about freeing himself from the grip of resentment that had held him captive for so long. "I don't know what the future holds, Amina," Kwame said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I can't keep carrying this weight. I need to heal, for both of us. Maybe, in time, we can find a way to rebuild what we lost, but for now, I need space. I need to find myself again." Amina nodded, her face a mixture of relief and sorrow. She understood that this was not a reconciliation, not yet. But it was a beginning, a small step toward healing, toward forgiveness, and perhaps, eventually, toward understanding. As Kwame left Amina's house, the weight of the decision hung heavy on his shoulders. He had not forgiven her completely, not yet, but he had let go of the anger that had poisoned his heart. He didn't know what the future held, or if they would ever truly reconcile, but he felt something shift within him, a sense of freedom, a sense of possibility. The road ahead was still unclear, but for the first time in weeks, Kwame felt that it was his to choose. In the days that followed, Kwame focused on rebuilding his own life. He returned to the work that had once defined him, throwing himself into his crops, his responsibilities, and his community. But this time, he did it with a new sense of purpose. The betrayal had changed him, but it had also given him the clarity to see what truly mattered: his own peace, his own growth, and his ability to move forward, regardless of what had happened in the past. The village began to see a change in Kwame, too. He was no longer the broken man who had left in anger. He was stronger, more determined, and though the scars of the past would never fully fade, he was learning to live with them. He had faced the darkness of betrayal and come out the other side with a new understanding of who he was. And in that, there was a quiet strength that resonated with everyone around him. He had learned that the most important journey was not the one to escape the pain. The days that followed were a slow but steady rebuilding of the man that Kwame had once been, and the man he was learning to become. It wasn't an easy process. Every corner he turned in the village, he was reminded of the life he had left behind, the life that had been torn apart by betrayal. Yet, with each passing day, Kwame found that the sting of his pain began to dull. He returned to his work in the fields, where the rhythm of planting, tending, and harvesting gave him a sense of normalcy and purpose. It was hard at first, harder than he ever imagined it would be. His hands, once steady and strong, now seemed clumsy as he worked, distracted by the weight of his thoughts. But with every seed he planted, there was a sense of growth. The soil, he realized, was like his heart. It had been broken, but with time and care, it could be healed. In the village, people were talking. Some saw the changes in him, the new determination in his eyes. Others whispered about the return of Kwame, the man whose wife had betrayed him, and speculated on what would happen next. Would he rebuild his life with Amina? Would he move on to another woman? Or would he leave the village, as many people assumed he would, too scarred to stay? For the most part, Kwame ignored the rumors. He had learned long ago that people would talk no matter what, and it was his journey to walk, not theirs. But it wasn't just his own healing that weighed on Kwame. He had come to realize that the damage caused by Amina's betrayal hadn't just affected him, it had rippled through the entire community. Their families, their friends, their neighbors, they all felt the tension, the shame, the heartbreak. It was as though the whole village had been wounded, even though it wasn't their pain to bear. The elders had always taught him that a family's problems were a reflection of the village's strength, and in this case, the village had faltered. Kwame knew he couldn't heal alone. He had to help the village heal, the one that led back to himself. One afternoon, after a long day of work, Kwame gathered the villagers together. It was a small gathering, but it was enough. The elders, the men, and the women who had watched him grow up, they were all there, standing in the open square in the center of the village. The air was thick with anticipation, as though everyone knew something important was about to happen, but none could guess what. Kwame stood before them, his heart pounding. For so long, he had been the silent one, the one who kept his pain buried deep inside. But today, he knew he had to speak. He had to let the village know that he had not come back to be a victim of betrayal, but to be a part of the healing process. I know you've all heard the stories, Kwame began, his voice strong but tinged with emotion. You've heard of the pain, the betrayal, the hurt. You've watched me struggle, and I've seen the pity in your eyes. But I am here today to tell you something important, not just for me, but for all of us. The villagers shifted, leaning forward in silence, waiting for him to continue. Pain comes to all of us in different ways. It comes in loss, in betrayal, in disappointment. But it also comes with a choice. We can let that pain define us, or we can use it to grow stronger. I've made my choice, Kwame said, looking each person in the eye. I choose to forgive. Not because Amina deserves it, but because I need it. I need peace. I need to be free of the weight of anger, of shame, of regret. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The villagers exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. They had never seen Kwame like this, so open, so vulnerable, yet so strong. Some of them were skeptical, others unsure if they could believe in his words. But the truth in his voice was undeniable. I want us all to understand something, Kwame continued. We are a community. And when one of us suffers, we all suffer. This betrayal has not just affected me, it has affected all of us. But if we are to heal, we must do it together. We must support one another, not just in good times, but in the darkest of times. There was a moment of silence as the weight of his words settled over the crowd. Then, slowly, one by one, the villagers began to speak. The elders shared their wisdom about forgiveness and healing, reminding everyone that life was full of hardships, but also full of opportunities for redemption. The younger men, who had watched Kwame's pain from a distance, spoke of their own struggles and how they, too, had learned to face their fears and embrace forgiveness. Kwame listened, feeling a sense of solidarity he hadn't known in years. For the first time, he felt as though the village was beginning to heal, not just because of his actions, but because they were all willing to face their own pain and move forward together. In the weeks that followed, Kwame continued to work hard, rebuilding not just his own life, but the trust and camaraderie he had lost with the villagers. He offered forgiveness to Amina, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary for both of them to move on. The road to forgiveness was long, and sometimes he found himself questioning whether he had made the right choice. But the more he let go of his anger, the more he found peace in his heart. It wasn't until one fateful evening, as Kwame sat with the elders by the fire, that he realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't about pretending that the hurt had never happened. It was about acknowledging the pain, owning it, and choosing to move forward in spite of it. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it allowed room for growth, for healing, and for hope. Amina, too, began her own journey. She spent months working to regain the trust of those she had betrayed, not just through words, but through actions. She worked alongside Kwame in the fields, helping him with the tasks she had once shared with him. Slowly, they began to rebuild their relationship, not as husband and wife, but as two people who had learned the hard way that love and trust were fragile, and that they had to be nurtured with care and patience. The village, too, began to heal. The whispers of Kwame's return faded, replaced by a renewed sense of community. People worked together, supported one another, and remembered that, no matter how dark the past, there was always the possibility for a brighter future. Kwame's journey wasn't over. There were still days when the weight of his past would creep into his thoughts, when the memory of betrayal would threaten to pull him back into the darkness. But with every step forward, he grew stronger. And as he stood at the edge of the village one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he knew that he had found something more valuable than revenge or anger. He had found peace. And that was something no one could ever take from him. Months passed since Kwame's pivotal decision to embrace forgiveness, and the village of Amangwi began to see a change that many thought would never come. The once quiet man who had disappeared in the wake of betrayal had returned, not just as a survivor, but as a beacon of strength. As the seasons changed, so did the dynamics of the community. People who had once been distant, unsure of how to treat him, began to draw closer. The weight of the past still hung like a shadow, but it was no longer a weight they couldn't bear. Kwame had shown them that it was possible to move forward, that the hurt could be transformed into something new, something hopeful. One morning, as Kwame worked the fields, he looked up to see Amina walking toward him. She was carrying a basket, her face a mixture of determination and uncertainty. Since their last conversation, they hadn't spoken much. They had existed in separate spheres, learning to navigate the awkwardness that came with shared history. Amina had been doing her best to earn back the respect and trust of the villagers, but Kwame knew the hardest person to forgive would be herself. "Kwame," she called softly as she approached, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken words. He turned to face her, wiping the sweat from his brow. Their eyes met, and for a fleeting moment, everything felt like it had before. But it wasn't the same. Too much had changed, too much had been lost. Still, there was an understanding between them now, a quiet recognition that forgiveness had allowed them both to heal in their own way. "I've been thinking," Amina said, her voice wavering, about how things used to be, and how they can't go back. I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm trying to do better. For myself. For you, too. I want to find a way to move forward, even if we're never the same. Kwame nodded, his face calm but with a hint of sadness. I know, Amina. We can't go back. But we can move forward. We've both changed, in ways I don't think we fully understand yet. What matters now is that we choose to live in the present, not in the past. We've made peace with our pain. It's time to see what's left. Amina hesitated for a moment, then placed the basket on the ground and sat beside him, the simple gesture of sitting together a quiet symbol of reconciliation. For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sounds the distant chatter of the village and the rustle of the wind through the trees. It was a peaceful moment, one that spoke louder than any words could. I'm proud of you, Kwame, Amina said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I never thought I'd see the day when you could look at me without anger. You've done what I never thought was possible, you've forgiven me. Kwame sighed, the exhaustion of the past months weighing heavily on him. Forgiveness isn't easy. It wasn't for you, and it wasn't for me. But it's the only way forward. We can't live shackled to the past, no matter how much it hurts. Amina smiled faintly, and for the first time in months, it was a smile that wasn't weighed down by guilt. You're right. I've spent so long blaming myself, not realizing that forgiveness wasn't about fixing the past. It's about giving ourselves permission to heal, to be better. As the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the village, Kwame and Amina stood together, not as a couple trying to revive something that was lost, but as two individuals who had endured a storm and were now learning to stand side by side in the aftermath. It wasn't perfect. There were still scars, still moments when the pain resurfaced. But there was also the recognition that they had done the hard work, the work of healing. The days following their conversation were filled with small, quiet moments of progress. Kwame and Amina didn't rush back into the life they had once shared, but they began to rebuild their relationship slowly, one step at a time. They worked together in the fields, shared meals with the villagers, and began to show up for each other in ways that mattered. The village, too, began to embrace the healing process. It wasn't just Kwame and Amina who had been wounded. The entire community had felt the sting of betrayal, and now, it was the community that was beginning to heal, too. The elders, who had once been skeptical of Kwame's decision to forgive, now saw the fruits of his choice. They had always known that forgiveness was a powerful force, but to see it in action, to see how it had transformed the village, filled them with awe. In a place where pride and honor had been so central to their way of life, Kwame's willingness to let go of his anger had not only freed him, but had inspired others to do the same. Slowly, as the seasons passed, things began to change in Amangwi. The village grew stronger, not because they had forgotten the past, but because they had learned to carry it without letting it weigh them down. The people began to trust each other again. They worked together, laughed together, and supported one another in ways they never had before. It was as though Kwame's act of forgiveness had sparked something within the community, a recognition that they were all human, flawed, and capable of healing. Amina, for her part, continued to work hard, earning the trust of the villagers in her own way. She knew that forgiveness was not something that could be demanded, but something that had to be earned over time. And so, she worked. She made amends where she could, and she gave herself the grace to learn from her mistakes. She wasn't perfect, but she was trying. One day, as the village gathered for a celebration of the harvest, Kwame stood at the center of the square, looking around at the faces of the people who had been a part of his journey. There was laughter in the air, a lightness that had been absent for far too long. The heavy weight of the past had finally been lifted, not because it had disappeared, but because the village had chosen to move forward together. Kwame knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. Life never was. But he also knew that the road to healing was not a straight line. There would be moments of doubt, moments of fear, and moments when the past threatened to pull them back. But he had learned that there was power in moving forward, in choosing hope over despair, and in embracing forgiveness not just for the other person, but for himself. As the night drew to a close and the villagers gathered around the fire, Kwame stood quietly in the background, watching them all. He wasn't the same man who had left this village months ago. He had been broken, but now, he was whole again. He had found peace, not in forgetting the past, but in learning to live with it. And in that, he had discovered something far more valuable than revenge or anger. He had found the strength to live again. As the months turned into years, the village of Amengwi seemed to breathe a new life into its surroundings, something vibrant and full of purpose. The scar that had once marked the community was no longer visible to the naked eye, though its presence was always felt beneath the surface, a reminder of how far they had come. Kwame had watched the transformation with a quiet satisfaction, but also with an understanding that healing wasn't something that happened overnight. It was a continuous journey, a long road of forgiveness, redemption, and shared growth. He had learned that there was no final destination, just the promise of every new day being better than the one before. Kwame's daily life had found a new rhythm. He still worked the fields, though with a lighter heart now. His hands, once weathered by the burden of sorrow, had regained their strength. They planted seeds with purpose, tended to crops with patience, and reaped harvests with pride. But more than just the physical work, Kwame had come to appreciate the quiet moments. The peaceful stillness of the mornings, where the mist would rise from the earth as the first light of dawn kissed the village. The sound of children's laughter as they ran through the fields, unburdened by the past, embodying a future filled with possibility. And, most importantly, the moments when he stood in the company of those who had witnessed his struggle, his transformation, and now shared in his peace. Amina, too, had blossomed in her own way. She was no longer the woman who had once shattered their lives, lost in guilt and regret. Instead, she had become someone who had learned to rebuild, not just her relationship with the village but her own identity. It had taken time, of course. Her days were spent with the women of the village, helping with chores, organizing communal tasks, and teaching the younger generation the ways of the land. She no longer sought redemption from others. Instead, she had learned to be her own source of strength, having accepted her mistakes and worked tirelessly to become a better version of herself. She knew there would always be people who would never forgive her fully, but that was no longer her concern. She had forgiven herself, and in doing so, had found peace. The couple had not rekindled their romantic relationship. They had found that what had once bound them together was no longer enough to sustain the bond they had once shared. But that didn't matter to either of them. They had grown into two separate individuals, each with their own purpose, their own path to walk, but they had come to respect and care for one another in a way that was more profound than anything they had once experienced. They had both been wounded, but they had healed in ways that allowed them to be better people, not for each other, but for themselves. Their bond now was one of mutual respect and understanding, not rooted in love but in shared history and the lessons learned from hardship. Kwame knew that he would always have a special place for Amina in his heart, not because of the past they had shared, but because of the future they had chosen to create independently. And Amina had come to realize that sometimes, love wasn't about staying together forever. Sometimes, it was about finding peace in letting go and allowing each person to evolve into who they were meant to become. In the heart of the village, something beautiful had taken root. The healing that had begun with one man's decision to forgive had spread, slowly, like wildfire. The village of Amengwi became a place of refuge, not just for the wounded and the broken, but for anyone seeking redemption, renewal, and the possibility of second chances. It was a place where people came not just to work the land but to find healing for their hearts, minds, and souls. The elders, who had long watched over the community with wisdom and patience, spoke of the power of forgiveness, not just in theory but in practice. They saw how it had not only saved Kwame and Amina but had saved the village itself. As the years passed, Kwame's role in the community evolved. He became one of the respected leaders of the village, not because he sought power but because his story had touched so many, and his actions had proven that true leadership came from within. People came to him for advice, for counsel, and sometimes just to listen to his quiet wisdom. He never pushed his thoughts onto others. Instead, he simply shared his experiences, offering a quiet reminder that growth and healing came from making peace with the past, rather than running from it. But despite all the progress, there was still an underlying question that lingered in Kwame's heart. He had spent so many years lost in grief, anger, and regret that he sometimes wondered if he had truly learned the full extent of what it meant to forgive. Could he ever forgive himself for allowing himself to become so consumed by the past? Could he ever fully heal from the pain of betrayal, or would it always haunt him, waiting to resurface at the slightest provocation? It wasn't until one evening, as the village gathered by the fire to celebrate another successful harvest, that Kwame finally found the answer. The village had come together in a circle, sharing stories, singing songs, and laughing into the night. The joy in the air was palpable, and for the first time, Kwame felt the weight of the past truly fall away. He sat there, surrounded by the people he had helped heal, and watched as the younger generation played and laughed, blissfully unaware of the struggles their parents and elders had faced. There, in that moment, Kwame realized something that had eluded him for so long. Forgiveness was not a destination, nor a single act. It was a way of living, a choice made every day to rise above the hurt, to see beyond the pain, and to choose peace over bitterness. It was not about forgetting the past, but about creating a future where the past did not hold power over them. Kwame smiled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for the journey he had taken. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But the healing process was ongoing, and he had learned to embrace it. He looked around the fire, his heart swelling with pride for his village, for Amina, and most of all, for himself. He had come so far, and in the process, had discovered something invaluable, that no matter how deep the wound, there was always the possibility of healing. And sometimes, the most important part of that healing wasn't just forgiving others, it was forgiving yourself. As the fire crackled and the village sang their songs of celebration, Kwame knew that the story of Amangwi wasn't just his own. It was the story of every person who had ever experienced loss, pain, and betrayal, and who had chosen, despite it all, to keep moving forward. And in that collective journey, they had found something far more powerful than revenge or bitterness. They had found redemption.